All right, Rabbi will say good morning. Let us begin with a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Our shir this morning is dedicated by our TALMUD TORAH sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in honor of their grandchildren. May they be Zochem Eretz Hashem to become the best version of themselves. Also, the TALMUD TORAH sponsorship for Daf Yomi refuah for Yehuda Ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Jeff and Karen Cohn, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Karen's mother, Mrs. Clara Oxman, on the 18th of Av. Our Daf Yomi sponsors today, Natan Leah Berry, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Leah's father, Tzvi Sherizan, Eliezer Avraham Tzvi, Ben Pesachya Leib, we hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, and all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. I will say we have a beautiful daf, really fascinating daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed Ches 39. We are picking up Eretz Hashem on the bottom of Lamed Ches Amud Beis Amar Abaye. Let's pick up 6 lines up from the bottom. Just also take the opportunity to thank Rabbi Kalman Akiva, to thank Rabbi Richter for giving the shir last week while I was away. Baruch Hashem, it's wonderful to be back in person with all of you. And with that, let us begin. So Amar Abaye, so we'll see some very interesting cases concerning the nature of the knas. Amar Abaye, Ba'ala Umesa. What's the halach in the following situation? A man goes ahead and violates a woman, and she dies. Now I will say, the case that we're talking about when she dies, if you look at Rashi, Ba'ala Umesa, Lo Hispik Ha'av Lahamido Bedin Ad Shemesa. The case over here is just the progression of events. A man violates a woman. Again, so father, generally this is a process that's handled by the father. The father will take the man to Beis Din. Beis Din will go ahead and adjudicate the case. And if the man is truly guilty, then halacha l'maaseh, he will pay the penalty payment. In this particular case, what happened over here is as follows. Man violated the woman. Reuven violated Rachel. But before Rachel's father had an opportunity to bring the case to the Beis Din, Rachel died. Rachel died. Again, I want to be clear. Not died a result of the violation, because that's a separate case. Now then suddenly this has transformed from a violation case to a murder case. This is talking about Rachel was violated, and then unfortunately she was hit by a bus. So death totally unrelated to the events that occurred beforehand. What's the halacha? Pater. Reuven, the perpetrator, is pater from paying the knas, pater from paying the penalty payment. Why is that? We've actually seen this before. Shene'emar v'nasana avi anara v'lo avi mesa. Because the pasuk says that the violator will pay the avi hana'ara, the father of the girl. Girl na'ara meaning that she's alive. V'lo avi mesa, and not to the father of the deceased. So a drasha on a pasuk that the penalty payment is only paid to the father of the victim when the victim is alive. Okay, so the Gemara says, something that Nabose Abaye sees this as a clear, straightforward limud, right? Straightforward halacha. Namely, again, halacha l'maisa, man violates a woman dies, violator is not subject to paying the fine. So the Gemara says that which was obvious to Abaye was actually not so obvious to Rava. The Gemara says, so Abaye mibayle the Rava. The Bay Rava will say, Rava asked an interesting question. Yesh beger bekever. Yesh beger bekever. Is there, literally translated it means, is there the concept of bagrus in the grave? Now let's go back for just a moment. We know that in the process of a girl's maturation into womanhood, there are three stages, as we'll see in just a moment. There's when she's a kitana, a na'ara, and a bogeres. Now, we know also something very interesting, which is that based on the drasha and the psukim, the din of ones, the din of violating, when a man violates a woman, the whole halacha that we have, namely that he has to pay the penalty payment, only applies when? When she's a na'ara. She's an na'ara. They both say that's just based on the gzeras hakasuv, just based on the psukim. So in other words, the penalty payment. Now, we'll qualify this in just a little bit, but what we call the 50 silver piece, the 50 shekel penalty payment, only applies in a situation where a man violates a na'ara. Okay, so here's the following situation. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Yesh beger bekever. Look at Rashi. Imesa b'na'arusa ad shelo amda b'din v'gizman bagrusa bekever mi chashiv beger or lo. So we'll say, what the question seems to mean is like this, that halacha l'maisa, do we look, or do Does the clock keep running even once the girl has passed away? Now, what's the nafka mina for that, Rabosai? Take a look at Rashi. Yesh beger bekever, the last Rashi on the daf. V'chi hechi dim lo espika la'amod b'din ad shebagra t'nan l'kamal b'parag narish nesbasa v'harei heim la'atzma v'lo labia v'hashta nami beger bekever mafkia koach ha'av u'b'na yorisla im yesh labein. So I'll say, here's the interesting case. What happens halacha l'maisa if we take a step back? Let's leave it. Remember, how did this whole sugya start? Whole sugya started was Abai came along and said Ruvain violated Rachel. Right? Rachel died before the court case had an opportunity to get started. So in that particular situation, how do we paskin? That ultimately Ruvain is off the hook for the penalty payment. Xeris HaKosov, it's a technicality. The Gemara says, by the way, for Abaye was pashit, for Rava is a question. Because Rava brought up the following situation, right? That's how, the Ba'i Rava was asking, Yesh beger bekever. Rava say, here's the question that Rava is asking. Ruvain violates Rachel. Rachel is a nara. They go ahead and they begin the court process. Right? That's what Rashi points out over here. Meisa ben Arusa, Achlo Amdabidin. I'm sorry, they did not yet begin the court process. And then what happens? Rachel dies. Now watch this. Now even though Rachel died, Beis Din continues the process. By the time they go ahead and they reach the verdict that Ruvain was guilty of violating Rachel, Rachel would have been 13 years old. 13 years old is what? Is a Bulgaris. And I both say, we're going to see something interesting. There's a whole confluence of events happening over here. We're going to see that. Let's take one more case. Ruvain violates Rachel. Okay? Rachel's alive. They go to Beis Din. Takes Beis Din a little bit of time. By the time Beis Din goes in and passes the verdict that Ruvain is chayiv for violating her, Rachel is 13 years old. She's a Bulgaris. So now Ruvain is going to pay the penalty payment. Who gets the penalty payment? So we haven't seen this yet, but we're going to see in a few days from now that if the verdict is passed when Rachel becomes a Bulgaris, she gets the money. Okay, so remember, even though obviously she was violated when she was a Nara, but now when a girl becomes a Bulgaris, she's a full-fledged adult. So therefore, again, her own personal autonomy, she gets the penalty money. Here's Rava's question. Now watch Rava's question. Rava's question is this: Ruvain violates Rachel, right? So Rachel dies, but Beis Din is still adjudicating the case. By the time Beis Din adjudicates the case, had Rachel been alive, she would have been 13 years old. So here's the shaila: Yesh beger bekever. Sounds strange, but can a girl reach bagrus in the grave? In other words, how do we look at Rachel now that she has passed away? Do we look at the age she would have been had she been alive? And had she been alive, she would have been 13. And therefore what? Who gets the knas? Now Rachel. The problem, of course, is Rachel's dead. So who would get the knas in her stead? Let's say she left behind a child. Which we're going to challenge. Let's say she left behind a child. So maybe the knas would go to her heir, to her child. Or do we say, Ein beger bekever? No. There's no bagrus in the grave. So essentially, once the girl dies, what happens? The clock stops, and she essentially halachically remains forever a nara. Which then means that when the Beis Din finds Ruvain guilty of violating Rachel, who gets the money? Her father. Now I will say, before we even delve into this case, what's the point of the Gemara over here? The point is, you see that according to Rava seems to feel that even once the girl has died, the proceedings against the violator can still continue. So that stands in contradistinction to Abaye. Because remember again, Abaye started by saying, once the girl died before the Beis Din proceedings got started, what's the halacha? We're done. In other words, at least we're done with the penalty payment. We're done. The point the Gemara is saying over is, you see, according to Rava says, no, we're not done, because what is Rava trying to understand? Rava's asking, at the end of the day, who will get the penalty payment once they go out and they reach the verdict? If you say yesh beger bekever, that a girl could become a Bulgaris even in the grave, then her child, will go ahead and get the penalty payment. If you say ein beger bekever, the father will get the penalty payment. But what you see according to everyone, or you see according to Rava, is that the proceedings continue even once she is no longer in this world. To which the Gemara says, do we say a girl could become a Bulgaris in the kever, and therefore ultimately the penalty payment goes to her child, her heir? Or maybe no, there's no bagros in the grave, and therefore once she passes away, halacha l'maisa again, her age is kind of frozen in time. Her age is frozen in time. But let's say now one of the interesting questions that is often asked regarding Tchias HaMesim, right? When Mashiach comes, Eretz Hashem b'sha'ah tova u'mitzlachos, right? B'karov. So on his resurrection, what age do people come back as, right? In other words, it's an interesting. This is an interesting. Do you come back at the age that you passed away at? Do you come back as a baby reborn? Do you come back? Interesting. So it's just fascinating that almost the better this yesh beger bekever. Is there the concept of halachic aging in the grave or not? Or at the end of the day, ultimately again, does death say what your status at the time of your death is the status that's locked in? So the Gemara says, 1 second, we'll say top of Lamites. So we'll say, let's analyze this. So we have two things going on over here. Number one, a fundamental machlokes, as can you initiate proceedings against the violator once the girl has died? Abaye says no. Rava seems to say yes. Now in Rava, then there's another question. What's the other question? Yesh beger bekever, in beger bekever. Do we view the girl's age? And do we look at the girl? Do we look at the girl's potential age at the time of the verdict? And therefore, again, had she been alive, she would have been a Bulgaris. Therefore, the penalty payment goes to her heir. Or ein beger bekever. No. Once she dies, her age is locked in. She's forever looked at as a nara. And therefore, if the violator is found guilty, the penalty payment goes to the father. So we'll say, if you hold yesh beger bekever, that means that by the time they reach the verdict, the girl would have been a Bulgaris, so therefore it goes to her heir. And the Gemara says, who's her heir? Her child. The Gemara says, her child, umi ma'abro, could this girl have become pregnant? In other words, we'll say, remember again, we're talking about, at the time of violation, the girl could not have been more than what? Been more than how old? 12 years old and 6 months. So the Gemara, let's just be less than that. V'atani we learn, Rabbi becoming Rav Nachman. Rabbi thought before Rav Nachman, Shalosh Nashim Misham Shos Beloch. We've had this Gemara a number of times. A couple of times in Yavamis already. So, Shalosh Nashim Misham Shos Beloch. We'll say there are 3 women who are permitted to use a moch. A moch is a cloth. This was a Talmudic form of birth control. So we'll say essentially this is a barrier method of birth control. The cloth could either be inserted before relations. The cloth could also be inserted after relations, but obviously not as effective. But Lamai said this is a barrier form of birth control. So the Gemara says, 3 women are permitted to go ahead and use birth control. Eluhain, these are the women. Kitana u'meuberes u'meinika. A kitana, who's a girl who's a minor. Meuberes, a woman who's pregnant. Meinika, a woman who is nursing. Why? Kitana shemet tisaber v'tamus. So we'll say kitana because it would be dangerous for a kitana to become pregnant. Right, her body cannot handle that type of event, and therefore she would die. So, because for a kitana it would be sakanas nefashos, ultimately she's permitted to use this moch. Mu'uberes, a pregnant woman. Shemetasa ubra sandal. I will say there was this Talmudic fear that ultimately, again, a woman who is pregnant could become pregnant again with a second pregnancy, and therefore halacha l'maisa, it could go ahead and impact the first fetus. Again, I will say, just to point out, so you could have situations where a woman who is pregnant could have an ectopic pregnancy, but Lamaisa, again, remember, whenever you see these fears about Chazal regarding science, so again, this is based on their understanding of medicine. It's not halachic, it's societal, it's contemporary. So halacha l'maisa, again, a pregnant woman, they were concerned that if she become pregnant again, it can negatively impact the first fetus, and ultimately, me'emika, shema tegmal aspina. So a nursing mother, they're concerned that if a nursing mother becomes pregnant, it will diminish her milk supply and ultimately negatively impact her baby who she is nursing. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ezui kitana." By the way, it's a kitana. So mibas achat esrei shana v'yom echad ad shteim esrei shana v'yom echad. So what's a kitana? A kitana ultimately is from 11 years old in one day to 12 years old in one day. Pachos mikan v'yeser al kein mishameshes kedarka ba'olachas div Rabbi Meir. less than that age or older than that age, she could have relations normally without any type of protection. Because again, younger than that age, apparently there's no way she's going to become pregnant. And I will say, again, just to be clear, Chazal are not condoning or not encouraging these types of relationships. We're just talking about from a pure halachic perspective. So again, older than that age, obviously she's old enough, at least Bismana Gemara, to go out and become pregnant. The Chachamim say in all of these cases, birth control is not permitted. Kadosh Baruch Hu will have rachmanis on these women. So we'll say, this happens to be a fascinating sugya. This is the sugya of birth control, and whether or not, again, birth control is permitted or not. And in the halachic discussion of birth control, there are kind of two different schools. I mean, there's more than two, but two different schools of thought. The first school of thought, Rabbi Meir's school of thought, says that when pregnancy poses an active danger for women, halacha l'maisa, again, the use of birth control is going to be permitted. Now, again, I will say in the world of birth control, there are also different forms of birth control. Here it's actually interesting, the Gemara is talking about a significant form, like a barrier form, which is considered to be a heightened form of birth control. Okay? Then you have the school of thought of the Chachamim. And the Chachamim say, pregnancy always carries risk. There's no such thing as a risk-free pregnancy. Pregnancy, by definition, constantly and consistently poses a mortal danger to both the mother and the fetus. That's the nature of it. When it comes to things that are inherently dangerous, but they're also part of day-to-day living, we employ the concept of Shomer Pesayim Hashem. Shomer Pesayim Hashem means Hashem watches over the simple people, which essentially is the halachic license to engage in dangerous activities because they are considered to be parts of everyday life. Rabosai, remember again, driving a car, I don't know what the statistical probability of chas v'shalom, getting into a fatal car crash is every time you get behind the wheel, but it exists. Lo aleinu, but it exists, right? That risk exists. So if it exists, then halach l'maisa, how are we permitted to drive? Because at the end of the day, there's a concept of I have to watch over my health. I have to stay away from life-threatening situations. So how am I allowed to drive if driving carries with it a statistical probability of risk? And what's the answer? It's part of activities of daily living. I will say, contrast that with skydiving. I will tell you, if somebody were to ask me, is it halachically permitted to go skydiving? The answer is unequivocally no. No, there's why play? But I love it. But it's less risky. Skydiving is less risky. That's fine. But jumping out of an airplane is a risk that is just unnecessary. You don't need to do it. If your life is not exciting enough without skydiving, see me after the shir. I'm happy to give you plenty of other suggestions for things you could do. Right? So let's say, but Lamaisa, this is very important. Because this is kind of Shon Pesach. The Chacham say this is really fascinating, hashkafically and halachically. The Chacham essentially say, even in these situations where pregnancy poses a danger, birth control is asr. Birth control is asr, right? Why? Because by definition, getting pregnant is, we'll call it an activity of daily living. It always comes with risk, but yet we do it anyway, because it's part just of the activities of daily life. And I will say, I want to point out that there are poskim like this. The Satmar Rav, Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh L'Bracha, was known as a kanoi against the use of birth control, even in situations where there might have been a potential risk to health, because of Shon Pesayim Hashem. Incredible idea. We'll say, so okay, let's get back. So here's our problems. Let's go back. Let's just retrace our steps. So Rava's asking, do we hold yesh beger bekever in beger bekever? If you hold yesh beger bekever, that a girl could become a bogeres even in the grave, that means if the Beis Din finds Ruvain guilty of violating her, halacha l'maisa what? The knas will go to her offspring. Here's the problem. How could she have offspring? So maybe she became pregnant when she was a nara and gave birth when she was a nara. Here's the problem. Both say, how long is narus? 6 months. A girl can't become pregnant to give birth in 6 months. There's only 6 months between narus and bagros. Maybe Chazal meant was like this. there's no less than 6 months between Narus and Bagrus. But what? Could be more. The Gemara says no. Ha Ella Kama. Or both say the Gemara use lashon of Ella. Ein bein Narus leBagrus Ella Shishi Chadashim. Ella means what? Only. There's only 6 months. So therefore, I will say the idea of a Nara having a child who could potentially inherit the Knas seems to be impassable. Ella, the Gemara says you're right. Ella, the Gemara says, Ella, this is what Rava was asking. Yesh beger bekever. Here was Rava's question, I will say. Yesh beger bekever upaka av. Do we say that halacha lemaisa? There is beger bekever. We'll say so. Beger bekever means, again, I just want to be clear. This is talking about a specific case. Reuven violated Rachel when she was a Nara. Rachel dies, unrelated to the violation. Beis Din begins its proceedings, finds Reuven guilty. But at the time of the verdict, had Rachel still been alive, she would have been 13 years old. So do we say yesh beger bekever? Do we say that a girl could become a bogeres from the grave? Do we say that? So listen to this. So this was Rava's question. Yesh beger bekever upaka av. So both say, do we say yesh beger bekever? And what that means, yesh beger bekever, is the father loses his rights. Now I will say, what happens in this case when the father effectively loses his rights? What happens? Who gets the knas? No one. So I will say, this becomes what we call mamon she'im tovin. Money for which there is no claimant, which effectively means that what? Reuven doesn't have to pay. Rashi says over here, Paka tvias av v'zach Allah b'masha b'yado she'im bal dino kayim uknas lav mamonu lo risha la'aviyah b'Toras Yerusha kokam adol gav say. So remember again, it's very important. This is a knas, this is a penalty payment, not mamon. Knas is not inheritable. Knas is not really inheritable. So therefore, in this kind of case, if you hold in beger bekever, right? If you hold yesh beger bekever, that means ultimately, again, the father, right? The father really has no rights, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, Reuven doesn't have to pay anyone. O dilma in beger bekever, v'lo pagav, or maybe not. Maybe in beger bekever, in which case we still look at this girl, Rachel, as a nara, and therefore halacha l'maisa, when the Beis Din finds Reuven guilty, Reuven will have to pay the father. So we'll say that was the shaila ultimately again of Rava. So we'll say Mar baravashi ba'ilihachi. So we'll say, so I just want to point out over here, what we have right now is a machlokes Abaye and Rava. According to Abaye holds once the girl dies, the process for the knas is shut down. There's nothing more to talk about. There's nothing more. So according to Abaye, there is no discussion, yesh beger bekever, ein beger bekever. That discussion doesn't move. Once Rachel dies, and what we're talking about over here, a very specific case where Rachel died, when? Before the court proceedings began. Because if Rachel died after the court proceedings began, we'll deal with that case separately. Right now, she died before the court proceedings began. Abaye says, if she died before the court proceedings began, we're done. There's no knas. Rava seems told that we could continue the court proceedings even after she died, or I should say, we could begin the court proceedings even after she died, and therefore, according to Rava, I have the shaila of yesh beger bekever or ein beger bekever. So Mar baravashi asked the following shaila: Misa ose bagrus or ein misa ose bagrus. So we'll say Mar baravashi he asked a little bit differently. He said, does Misa affect Bagrus? Does Misa essentially affect instantaneous Bagrus or not? To which the Gemara answers, Teku. Okay, to which the Gemara ultimately says, we're not sure. Fine. So, Boy Minei Rav Me Abaye. We'll say again, I just want to point out, the way we paskin is we paskin like Abaye, and therefore the Rambam paskins, halacha l'maisa, if the girl dies before the proceedings began, there's no knas. Again, because the Rambam accepts a Joshua ben Asan la'aviyah na'ara v'lo la'avi mesa. So therefore, both say, once you paskin like Abaye, then obviously the whole discussion of yesh beger bekever, ein beger bekever, is irrelevant. So that's how he paskin. If Reuven violated Rachel and Rachel died before the court proceedings began, then halacha l'maaseh, in that situation there is no knas penalty payment. Again, like I said, we'll see on Daf Mem Aleph what we do if she dies after the court proceedings began. We'll get to that. Next case. Tubayim Rava me'abai. Rava asked Abai the following kasha. Ba'ala v'nis arsamahu. Here's an interesting case. Reuven violates Rachel. And then what happens? Rachel has erusin with another man. Right? Rachel decides that she's going to marry someone else. So Rachel accepts erusin from Shimon. So we'll say, so now what's the shaila? The shaila is, who gets the penalty payment? Who gets the penalty payment? Does Rachel get the penalty payment because now she's an arusa? Or ultimately, again, does her father still get the penalty payment? Mahu, Amarle, Miksiv v'nasan la'avia na'ara shelo arusa. Does the pasuk say you shall give to the father of the girl who is not an arusa? In other words, just because Rachel is an arusa, why would that preclude the father from going in and getting the penalty payment? I'm sorry, Ba'ala v'nises liatzma. So we'll say, yeah, we learned in a brayso, so we're going to see this later on as well. If Reuven violates Rachel, and then Rachel gets married, not to Reuven, to someone else, to Shimon. And we'll say the halacha is, Rachel gets the penalty payment. So miksiv v'nasan la'avia na'ara shalo nesua. So does the pasuk say you shall give to the father of the girl who's not nesua? In other words, why don't we give it to the father in that case as well? To which the Gemara will tell you here's the fundamental difference. Hachi ashta hasam ha'olu bagros motzim mirshosav v'nisuin motzim mirshosav ma bagros ba'aleh bagra li'atzma af nisuin ba'aleh v'niseis li'atzma. I will say this is very important. We're going to see these concepts a little bit later on as well. We'll say, halacha l'maisa. If Reuven violates Rachel, right? And by the time the Beis Din gets to adjudicate the case, Rachel is a bogeres. Who gets the money? Rachel. Why? Because we'll say, what does Bagros do? Bagros removes a girl from a father's domain and gives her own autonomy. She is her own independent person. So for some reason, Beis Din only got around to passing the verdict when she's a bogeres. Ultimately, again, she gets the knas money. Same idea, we'll say, what does Nisuin do? Nisuin marriage removes a girl from her father's domain and gives her autonomy. It's true she's in her husband's domain, but gives her own autonomy. Right? So therefore, I will say, it's interesting. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, these two cases are similar. So therefore, if Reuven violates Rachel, and then Rachel becomes a bogeres, Rachel gets to keep the knas. Similarly, Reuven violates Rachel, then Rachel gets married, Nisuin. Then Beis Din passes the verdict, Rachel gets the knas. Because those two states, Bagros and Nisuin, are similar. They both vest Rachel with complete autonomy. Contrast that, Ela Erusin, Mi Kamafki Mirshusei Da'avlagame. I will say, when a girl accepts Erusin, does that fundamentally remove her from her father's domain? And the answer is no. After all, Hatzanan we learned, Na'ara ha'me'urasa, avia ubayla, mefirin la nidareha. They both say, what did we learn? That ultimately, again, when a girl is betrothed, when ultimately she has erusin, they both say, how does it work with the revocation of her vows? Both her father and her husband have the ability to do so. So you see from here that erusin does not go ahead and vest a girl with full autonomy by removing her from her father's domain. So therefore, I will say, halacha l'maisa, 3 halachas come out of this. Halacha number 1, if Reuven violates Rachel, and by the time Beis Din goes ahead and passes the verdict, Rachel is a bogeres, she gets the money. Halacha number 2, Reuven violates Rachel, Rachel then gets married, Nisuin to Shimon, Beis Din passes the verdict that Reuven is chayiv, right? Rachel gets the money. Halacha number 3, Reuven violates Rachel, Rachel accepts erusin from Shimon, Beis Din passes the verdict, father of Rachel gets the money. That's the 3 halachas, Rabbi said. Beautiful. So we emerge over here with really 4 halachas, the 3 that we just mentioned, and the original one, namely, that if Reuven violates Rachel and Rachel dies, a death unrelated to the violation, ultimately there is no longer any knas payment that he is chayiv. Beautiful. Says the Mishnah, Hamefate no sin shlosha devarim ba'ones arba. So we'll say now we're going to go ahead and get into the discussion regarding the mafata versus the ma'anis. Up until now, we've been focusing on ones, on the man who violates the woman. We'll say there is another parallel case of mafata, a man who seduces a woman. So we'll say the Gemara says, the Mishnah says this also, Hamefata no sin shlosha dvarim. A man who seduces a woman pays three buckets of three. We'll call them three things. Ba'ones arba, and the man who violates a woman pays 4 payments. Let's analyze this. Hamefata knows. So what does the mefata? What does the seducer pay? Boshes upegam ukinas. So the mefata pays boshes, which is humiliation, pegam, depreciation, and kinas, which is the penalty payment. Mosef alav ones shenosin esat sar. We'll say the man who violates a woman pays a 4th payment, which is sar, pain and suffering. Ma bein ones lemefata. What is there between ones and mefata? Ha ones nosin esat sar, va mefata eno nosin esat sar. Number one difference is the ones pays for pain and suffering, which makes sense, right? The mefata, the seducer, because at the end of the day this was consensual. Ultimately, again, consensual with a nara. I just want to be clear. So obviously, I will say that's why there's a penalty payment, because this man is obviously taking advantage of this girl. So again, but there's not going to be tsar. There's not going to be pain and suffering. V'amefata inu nosin esat tsar. Ha'ones nosein miyad. We'll say a couple of interesting distinctions. Ones, if a man violates a woman, he pays the penalty payment immediately. V'amefata l'chishiyotze. Now what is interesting, the mefata, the seducer, only has to pay the penalty payment in the event of the dissolution of the marriage. Now, we're going to see what that means, because that sounds like they're automatically getting married, which is not the case. We'll see what it means. Actually, take a look at Rashi. I'm going to ruin it a little bit for you, because Rashi says it over here. 5 lines off the bottom in Rashi. L'chishiyotze. B'gemara parach atu ishtohi. I don't understand. We're going to see that by the mefata, when a man violates a woman, he has an obligation to marry her, and the violator has no choice. The father of the girl, or the girl herself, has a choice. But the man who violates, ultimately, again, if the father or the girl want the marriage to proceed, the violator doesn't have a choice. In the case of the seducer, everyone has a choice. Everyone has a choice to make over here. So the Gemara says, Rashi says, "Gemara parich atu ishtohi umefarish la lechishelo yichnos dimkonsa eno nosin knas." We'll say we're going to see that halacha l'maisa in the case of the seducer, the only time he pays the penalty payment is if he doesn't marry her. If he marries her, ultimately, again, there is no penalty payment. If halacha l'maisa, again, he does not marry her, that is when there is going to be a penalty payment. Again, we'll see this in the Gemara. Ones, we're going to see the halacha l'maisa, no matter what, there is a penalty payment. So the Gemara goes right. Ones shosa ba'atzitzo. So the ones was the man who violates the woman literally drinks out of his pot, which is the metaphor for saying no matter the type of woman that he violated, he must marry her. He has a halachic obligation to marry her. But the seducer, imratzala hotzi motzi. Again, we'll see exactly what this lashon means, I will say. But bepashtos, what it means is the seducer has a choice about whether or not he wants to marry this woman. What does it mean that the violator has to drink out of his pot? Afilu hi chigeres, afilu hi suma, va'afilu hi mikuashchin. Even if she's crippled, or she's blind, or she's covered with boils, if this is the woman who he violated, this is the woman who he is obligated to go ahead and marry. However, the Gemara says, O she'ena ru'uya lavo bekal Yisrael, lavo b'Yisrael, eno rashay l'kaima. There is an exception to this rule. If he violated a woman who he is not allowed to marry, let's say Reuven violated Rachel, and Rachel is a mamzeres. So in that case, Reuven is not allowed to marry her. In that case, obviously the penalty, the halacha does not require her to marry her. It does not require him to marry. Shneimar v'lo siel isha. The pasuk says by the violator, she must become his wife. Isha haru'uya lo. That presupposes that what? That a halachic marriage is permitted between Reuven and Rachel. So let's analyze. We'll say tsar demai. So we'll say one of the interesting distinctions now between ones and mefata. So now what we've seen is like this: the seducer pays three payments, right? Boshes, humiliation, Pegam, depreciation, and Knas, the penalty payment. The violator, the ones pays a fourth penalty payment. What's the fourth penalty payment? Tsar, pain. So both say the Gemara has the interesting question. Tsar demai. When we say tsar, what tsar are we referring to? They both say it sounds like a strange question, but you're going to see why the Gemara is asking it. Amar Avu de Shmuel, tsar shechavta lo al gabe karka. It must be the tsar that he threw her down to the ground. The idea being over here that this obviously is a violation, so therefore again he must have used force, and therefore the act of throwing her down to the ground obviously caused her pain. And I will say you're going to see why the Gemara there's a much more obvious pain, right? The actual just pain of intercourse, the actual pain. So we'll say you're going to see the reason the Gemara does not automatically jump to that is because the Gemara assumes that the first act of relations is always going to be painful for a woman, right? While the first act of relations, which ruptures the basulim, is always going to be painful. So the Gemara seems to feel that this case there must be some additional level of tsar. In other words, since the tsar of the Bia Rishona is just, so to speak, a fact that she's going to have to endure, the Gemara assumes that maybe there's a different kind of tsar over here. That's why the Gemara doesn't start with the actual pain of intercourse, because we assume that pain is going to have to be endured at some point in time. So it says the Havamina, maybe it's a different kind of tsar. So maybe it's the tsar that is throwing her down to the ground. So Maskif for Rabbi Zera, Elame Ata Chavtal Agabi Shirain, Hachanavi Depater. Okay, so what happens if he threw her down on a bed of silk? So there's no pain of being thrown down. Then what? He's going to be pater from tsar? So maybe you'll say yes. Vatanya Rabbi Shimon Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Ones inu mishalem es tsar. Supposed to listen to this. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda saying to Rabbi Shimon that Ones doesn't pay tsar. Why doesn't he pay tsar? Mipnei shesofa on the days mipnei shesofa lehitztaer tachas baila. Because the Rebbe says she's going to have this pain with her husband. In other words, the Rebbe saying, if you think it's about the tsar of the bia is going to be incurred anyway, even if she were to get married. Amulol, to which the Gemara says no. Eina dome nivelas ba'onis nivelas parasa. So the Gemara has to work through this. Chas v'shalom. We'll say you can't compare the discomfort that may be experienced in the bia rishona of a secure and loving marriage with the pain of a bia rishona with a woman who's being violated. In other words, we're saying, I just want to show you what's just happened over here, which is really quite interesting, which is that, and this is sometimes when we discuss sensitive issues in Gemara. So Gemara is a book of halacha. Halacha all of it just has to look at facts in a dispassionate way. So when the Gemara talks about the tsar of a woman being violated, the Gemara says, well, 1 second. From a purely analytical perspective, if we're going ahead and looking at the tsar as the tsar that a woman has from a first act of relations, well, she's going to have that tsar anyway at some point in time when she gets married. So ultimately, again, that can't be the tsar that we're referring to over here, because the tsar of ones is something additional. To which the Gemara says, sometimes you can't look at facts dispassionately. You can't look at facts dispassionately. And the Gemara says, you have to understand that the pain of a bia rishona that a woman has with her husband is going to be fundamentally different than the pain of a bia rishona that she experiences at the hands of a man who is violating her. So therefore, by definition, even though, again, technically one could say it falls under the same, it's two different types of tsar. To which the Gemara says, the other possibility is tsar shel pisa karaglayim. Ultimately, Rabbi Rabba says it's the tsar of the violator spreading her legs. In other words, Rabbi say the act of violation is not just about the bia rishona. First of all, I want to point out none of these things are mutually exclusive. In other words, the tsar could be a composite, ultimately again, of all of the trauma she experiences. The getting thrown down. right? The violator, forcing himself upon her, right? Spreading her legs forcibly. The act of Bia Rishona, which is done forcibly. All of this is part of the tsar. Dechinu Omer, the Gemara quotes the pasuk, quoting over here the pasuk from Yecheskel. Vatifaski es raglayech lechol over, vatarbi es taz nusayach. So let's say actually a very strong pasuk. The Navi Yecheskel goes ahead and compares Klal Yisrael to an immoral woman who is willing to have relations with any man who passes by. Ihachi mefutanami. If that's the case, that it's the pain of the spreading of the legs. So then Lamaisa again, why isn't the man who seduces a woman, why isn't he chayiv for that tzara as well? So I'll say, there are a number of things that's happening over here. There's the fact that the man who violates the woman forces her legs apart. There's a tzara in that. The Gemara also understands that perhaps inherent in Bia is that the woman has an uncomfortable position. So even in the case of mafuta, even in the case ultimately again of the man who seduces the woman, perhaps by definition there's inherent discomfort for the woman from the position she has to assume during Bia. To which the Gemara says, Yachim mafutanami, so Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Baravua, Mashal de mafuta lama davardoma. Here's what I'll give you a mashal for a woman who's seduced. La adam she'omer lechavero, karish shirayin sheli v'hi pater. It's compared to a person who says, cut my silk and you'll be pater. In other words, Rabbi say, what does that mean? That sometimes it could be that even when a woman engages in a consensual act of relations, there's an element of discomfort. But because it's consensual, therefore what? She's mochel, right? She forgives any tsar that may come about. So comparable to a case of a person, I will say, if I say to you, Ruvain, come and rip my shirt. Okay, so Ruvain damaged me, but Lamaisa what? I forgive the damage. So what's actually very interesting. So the Gemara is acknowledging that perhaps just inherent in the act of Bia is just an element of positional discomfort for the woman. So why isn't there tsar payment every single time there's relations? Because ultimately, because it's consensual, even if there is some level of tsar, halacha l'maisa, again, a woman forgives, a woman is mocheles on that tsar. Tosfos will say, points out over something very interesting, which is, she's mocheles on that tsar, even though what? She never articulates that particular mechila. In general, I will say, if you're going to be mochel on something, you generally, if you're going to forgive something that you're entitled to, generally you have to articulate it. What's interesting over here is that even though a woman she doesn't articulate this mechila, situationally, because she's willingly engaging in an act of relations, we understand that mechila is in fact present. Quite amazing. So listen to this. The Gemara says, Vipater. So the Gemara says, Shali, da'avuninu. But one second, that's fine. But Lamaisa will say, in these cases, remember again, she's quote-unquote being mocheles, but none of these damages are coming to her. Everything is going to the father. Ela amrav Nachman amrav baravua, pikchos shebahen omros, mefuta ein la tsar. So we'll say, Rabbi Baravua says, pikchos, the wise women say, the mefuta doesn't have tsar. Which I will say essentially means that when a woman engages in a consensual act of relations, there's no tsar. See, the havamina is that every act of relations always brings with it some element of tsar. I will say tsar doesn't have to mean pain. Tsar could mean what? Discomfort. Kamash v'lo know that when it's a consensual act of relations, it doesn't have to be any level of tsar. It's only, so therefore mafuta, even though again I will say this is an act, remember again to be clear, the mafuta, just because something is consensual doesn't necessarily mean it's not wrong. Like in the case of the Nara, ultimately, again, this is an adult taking advantage of a young girl. It's wrong. It's wrong, even though, again, she's quote-unquote giving her consent. Lemaisa, the Torah deems it as a wrongful act. But because it is quote-unquote consensual, even though I will say it's hard for us to fathom how consent could be given at such a young age, and obviously I will say contemporarily, obviously I will say this is a biblical framework reflecting a totally different societal setup. that has absolutely no place or really no relevance in our contemporary setting. I mean, it has relevance because it's Torah, but Lamaisa, obviously, we understand for contemporarily that a girl this age would have absolutely no valid consent. And again, for our purposes, it would be an act of pedophilia, not just an act of seduction or violation. Again, but leaving that aside, halacha lemaisa, the Gemara understands over here, because there is an element of consent, therefore there's no tsar. Contrast that ultimately with what? Contrast that with the case of ones, where halacha lemaisa, there is tsar. So the Gemara says, but we see that sometimes women do have discomfort, even in a consensual act of relations. This is very interesting. Abai says, Amrli Aim, my mother told me, I had no idea how this conversation got started, right? My mother told me, that when a woman has consensual relations, there might be some level of discomfort, but it's like warm water or hot water on a bald head. Okay, so I guess hot water, right? Hot water, I can speak to this one, right? So again, hot water on a bald head could be uncomfortable, but it's not painful. It's not painful. So apparently Abayi's mother was explaining to him, there could be some element of discomfort, but lemaisa, again, not pain. Rava Amar Amrli Bas Rav Chisda, Rava said, the daughter of Rav Chisda said to me, the daughter of Rav Chisda was Rava's wife. So Rava was saying, my wife told me, ki rivda dekusilta. There's sometimes the discomfort is like the piercing of a blood letter's needle. In other words, it sometimes you just like a moment of discomfort, but not real pain. Rav Papa Amrli Bas Rav Abba. Rav Papa said, the daughter of Rav Abba, Amrli Bas Abba Surah. The daughter of Abba Surah said to me, Kinama akusha b'chinchi. Sometimes the discomfort is like the experience of hard bread against the palate. Sometimes if you eat hard bread, so it gives you a little bit discomfort on the palate, but it's not pain. So we'll say what's coming out of all of these things is that halacha l'maisa, there could be some level of discomfort even in consensual relations, but l'maisa, it's discomfort and it's not pain. So because it's not pain, it doesn't rise to the threshold of tsar damages. We'll say we'll take something interesting about this, which is that this idea over here, especially the first one of Abayi speaking with his mother about this kind of stuff. I will say there is an important Musar Haskell on this, which is parents have to talk to their children about sexuality. It is incredibly important because our children will learn all about the wide world of sexuality. And either they'll learn it, well now they can learn it from the internet, or they'll learn it from their friends, or they'll learn it from something else. It is so much better for a parent to control the narrative. Because sometimes if you have the wrong initiation into your knowledge of sexuality, it could corrupt. It could literally ruin a person. And you see from here, it sounds weird that Abaye is discussing this with his mother. Again, I don't know that one has to get into this level of specificity with their children, but Lamaisa, to begin a discussion, and again I will say unfortunately, it really is unfortunately, it used to be that you could wait till children were a little bit older to engage them in some of these discussions, not anymore. We live in such a highly sexualized society. Everything is sexualized, and everywhere we go, see, most of us just become a little bit like numb to it because we experience it and you see it everywhere. But Lamaisa, it is so incredibly important to talk to our children about these inyanim. Because if we don't control the narrative, someone else will. That's the most asked from the Gemara. The Gemara goes weiter. Ha'onis nosin miyad. I just want to point out the takeaway message of this is that Lamaisa, again, the first distinction between ones and mefata is that ones has a penalty for tsar, pain and suffering. Mefata does not. Next. Ha'ones nosin miyad l'chshiyot. See, the ones has to pay the penalty payment immediately. The mefata, the chishiyotzi, and about saying the chishiyotzi sounds like when he divorces her. You are saying the chishiyotzi, ishtohi, I don't understand. That makes it sound like the mefata immediately marries the girl. Is that Shomer Abaye? Ima, the chishilo yichnos. No, Abaye says, here's what it means, Rabbi say. What it means is like this. If the mefata marries the girl, then he doesn't have to pay the penalty payment. If he doesn't marry the girl, then he has to pay the penalty payment. Tanya Rabbi that supports this. Even though we said that the mefata ultimately pays the penalty payment, when he decides not to marry her, Boshes upegam nosein miyad. Well, it's very interesting. There are different buckets of payments over here. So we'll say the penalty payment in the case of seduction, the penalty payment is only paid in the event that he doesn't marry her. If he does marry her, he does not have to pay that payment. But halacha l'maisa, the other payments, I will say, what are the other payments? Boshes and pegam, humiliation and depreciation, those have to be paid immediately. Those are paid immediately. Ve'echad ha'onis ve'echad ha'mefata, and both in the case of onis and mefata, bein hi u'bein aviha yecholna la'aki. Now, this is very interesting. In both the case of onis and mefata, both the girl, the girl, and her father have the ability to block the marriage. So we'll say, let's analyze this. So we'll say, so now let's get our facts in order because it's very important. So number one we've established is that halacha l'maisa, the payments for ones are tsar, boshes, pigam, and kinas, right? Penalty payments, right? Those are the four. For now, mefuta, it's everything minus tsar. So it's boshes, pigam, and kinas. But again, there's difference in the kinas by ones and mefata. By ones, when does he have to pay the kinas? Does he have to pay the kinas? Immediately. By mefata, the seducer, he only has to pay the kinas when he doesn't marry her. But if he does marry her, apparently he does not have to pay the kinas. Now, okay, let's delve a little deeper. What about the marriage itself? So the Gemara says, both in the case of onis and mefata, either the girl or the father have the right to say, no, we don't want the marriage. We don't want the marriage. So let's analyze. Bishlam and mefuta, when it comes to the seducer, it says, ksiv, imma'in yima'in aviha. Pasuk says, if the father will refuse to give his daughter to the seducer as a wife, Eili ala aviha, I only know ultimately that the father has the ability to go ahead and object. To go ahead and... That the father has the ability to go ahead and object. To go ahead and object. Hi atzma minayin. How do I know that ultimately, again, the girl has the ability to object as well? TALMUD lomar yima'in mikol makom. There was a Torah's lashon of yima'in. Object. So in any situation, in other words, whoever objects, he has the right to object, she has the right to object, they both have the right to object. Ela ones. So we'll say, so that's by mefuta. So by mefuta, I understand that both the girl and her father have the ability to object. Ela ones. What about the case of violation? Bishlama ihi. I understand that she has the ability to object. Ksiv velo sihiya. The pasuk says she will be to him as a wife. Midaito. It means she has to consent. And if she doesn't consent, then lemaisa, again, no marriage. Ela avia minal. And how do we know that in the case of ones of violation, that the father has the right to go ahead and object to marriage? We'll say first wide line, lamites on the base, Amar Abaye, shelo yehe chote niskar. The Bible says it's very interesting. How do we know that the father has the ability to object? In order that a sinner not benefit. In other words, the Bible say, because listen to this. Let's say if the father would not have the right to object to the marriage, the Bible says, you know what that would mean? That would mean that a man who really wants to marry a woman, but what? Right? Father is objecting to it. So what could the guy do? He could violate her, and now again the father has no say in the marriage. That doesn't make any sense. In other words, we'll say, so to allow the violator to marry this girl without the father having a say would reward a person for bad behavior. So Rav Amrava says it's a kavachomer. It's a kavachomer. Uma mefata shelo avar ela al das aviha. Both in the case of mefata, where again we'll call him ruvain, only when again it's the das of the father. I will say, why do you only go against the das of the father? Because since this is a case of seduction, therefore what? There was consent on behalf of the girl. So bein hi bein avi yechol nakiv. Nevertheless, in that case, both the girl and her father have the ability to object to the marriage. Ones sha'avra das avi ava das atzma l'kol shekin. All the more so ones. But I will say the violator, right? The violator has gone against the das of the girl and her father. So the father has the ability to object. So the Rebbe says it's interesting. Both Abaye and Rava are agreeing. In other words, we'll say they're agreeing on the principle. What's the principle? That both in the case of mefuta and now in the case of ones, both father and daughter have the ability to object. Just halacha l'maisa. This is now we're dealing in the case of ones. Halacha l'maisa, they're arguing about how we reach that conclusion. According to Abaye, the way we reach the conclusion is shelo yehei chotei nisker. A sinner should not be rewarded. Rava says from a kal v'chomer. So Rava lo amar ka Abaye. Rava doesn't say Abaye. Why? Kevan the kamashayim knas lo chotei niskerhu. Rava will say, since the violator has to pay a penalty, so l'maisa again, that's not called chotei nisker. Ultimately, the violator is not being rewarded. Abaye lo amar ke Rava. Abaye doesn't say like Rava. Why not? Mefate di'ihu matzi ma'akev avia nami matzi ma'akev. So I will say, in the case of mefuta, the case of mefate, I should say, excuse me, in the case of mefate, even the seducer himself, right? Reuven himself has the ability to say, I don't want to enter into this marriage. So if Reuven has the ability to go ahead and object, certainly what? The father has the ability to object. So the Gemara says, Ones, di'ihu lo matzi ma'akev. But in the case of ones, where again the violator doesn't have the ability to object, avia nami lo matzima akev. Perhaps the father doesn't have the ability to object as well. Tanya idach avavi sha'amru ones nosim miyad. So again, before we get to that, so therefore again, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, everyone is agreeing on the bottom line conclusion. They're just disagreeing about how to get there. So let's reinforce this. So therefore, I will say halacha l'maisa, both in the case of ones and mefata, both the girl and the husband, both the girl and the father have the ability to object to the marriage. Now here's the distinction. What about the perpetrator? So I will say that depends. In the case of ones, the perpetrator does not have a say. If the girl and the father want the marriage to occur, then he has to get married. In the case of mefata, in the case of seduction, ultimately the perpetrator has the ability to go ahead and object to the marriage as well. Incredible. Tanya idach, so the Gemara says another brayso. Afa pisha amru ones nosin miyad kishiyotze hu ein la'alav klum. So we'll say, listen to this. Even though we said that halacha l'maisa, in a case of where a man violates a woman, halacha l'maisa, he has to pay the penalty payment immediately. Nevertheless, if he divorces her, ein la'alav klum, she has no claim for a ksuva against him. So the Gemara says, kishiyotzi mi matzi mafikla. 1 second, he's not allowed to divorce her. Right? I will say part of the halacha over here is once a man violates a woman, he's obligated to marry her. And what? He's never permitted to divorce her. So what do you mean when he divorces her, there's no ksuva? Ema kisheteitze he ein la'alav klum. No, what I mean to say is like this. This is very interesting. If she decides to leave the marriage, so Reuven violates Rachel, and now what happens? They're married, right? They get married. So we'll say, so remember again, let's just go through the progression over here. Reuven violates Rachel. What's the first order of business when Reuven violates Rachel? First order of business, pays her the knas. After that, what's the next order of business? Tsar, Boshes, Pagam. Right? Then they get married. Assuming that halacha l'maisa, she wants to get married, the father wants them to get married, they get married. Okay? Now I'll say, what's the status of their marriage? They're never allowed to get divorced. Meaning what? She's not allowed to divorce her. But if she wants to leave the marriage, can she leave the marriage? Absolutely. What have we just learned, Rabbi saying? When she leaves the marriage, there's no ksuva. Apparently, Rabbi said, we almost look at it in halacha is the knas is the ksuva. So therefore, should she choose to leave the marriage, halacha l'maisa is no ksuva. Mace, what happens if he dies? Now she's a widow. So yotze kesef knasa b'ksuvasa. See what Rabbi say. Ultimately, again, the money of her ksuva, ultimately again took the form of the knas. Rabbi Yehuda Omer yesh la ksuva. Rabbi Yosef says no. She has a ksuva. She absolutely has a ksuva. To which the Gemara says, "V'mekimiflagi." What are they arguing about? Yesh la ksuva mana. She has a ksuva of a mana. I will say a mana is like a what? Like a second marriage ksuva. So what are they arguing about? Rabbanan Savri, Taima Maitakin, Rabbanan Ksuva. Why did Chazal institute a Ksuva? Kedei shelo teikala be'inov lahotzia. Rabbi say, why did Chazal institute a Ksuva? Because they didn't want a man to be flippant about divorcing his wife. So now that there's Ksuva, he's going to think twice before he divorces. Rabbi say, this doesn't apply in this case. Why? Because Rabbi say, in the case of the Ma'anis, in the case of the man who violates the woman, he's not allowed to divorce her. So therefore, there's no need for a ksuva. Rabbi Yosef ben Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef on the hand holds, hanami mitzar la ad amras hi lo ba'ina la. We'll say it's not true. Because halacha l'maisa, even though he can't technically divorce her, nevertheless what? He could make life so miserable for her that she's going to say, fine, I want out. To prevent him from doing that, Rabbi Yehuda says, halacha l'maisa, he has to pay her a ksuva. Say if Rabbi say halacha l'maisa, how do we paskin? So Rabbi say we paskin that halacha l'maisa there is no ksuva in these type of marriages. That halacha l'maisa again, once he marries her, essentially the knas takes the form of the ksuva, which I will say to a certain degree is even advantageous, because halacha l'maisa now, whereas the ksuva is a lien, the knas is actual payment right now in addition to all the other damages. But the knas takes the form ultimately again of the ksuva, and therefore halacha l'maisa, upon death or divorce, there would be no ksuva event. Also, we'll have to stop over here. We'll say incredible, overwhelming, fantastic Gemara tomorrow with Musar, with halacha, no agarata, but a lot of hashkafa. We'll say shkoyach.